Ever since I got this car, I've always wanted it to stop better, and now it definitely is. But I think I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. How did this all really start? To understand this story, we need to go back to the beginning. And in this case, the beginning happens to be the beginning of the last E30 episode.
Now at this point, we'd already met the guys over at the race shop. You remember, the ones who build track E30s and the parts to turn them into actual competitive race cars.
When I went over to learn from them, I asked a number of questions, one of which was how to make the car stop better. I figured if anybody knew really how, it would be them, since after all, they build E30 race cars on the regular. I liked what they said so much that I bought everything they suggested. In other words, a complete racing brake overhaul for the car, and I think it's going to make a tremendous difference. I think I'm getting ahead of myself again though. To see if these upgrades are worthwhile, we first need a baseline.
So to really figure out if these upgrades are going to do anything, we're going to need to figure out a way to see how bad the stock brakes are. And I don't have access to a track or anything like that, so we're going to have to improvise just a little bit.
First of all, what do I actually want to improve? And I can primarily group that into two different categories: brake feel / stopping power, and brake fade. Let's start with the first.
Just how well can the caliper squeeze the pads into the rotor? This is how the initial bite is, and it's very dependent on how aggressive your brakes are in general.
The more aggressive the brakes, the better the pedal feel and the faster the stop. And testing that one's easy. We just need to stop from the same speed before and after. Brake fade, on the other hand, is a bit harder to test. When brakes get too hot from repeated use, they lose their effectiveness.
So the other change is just a little bit harder to quantify without taking the car and pushing it on a track. But we can take the car to a fun road before and after and see if we notice any real difference in how we feel about the brake stopping power. We're basically just going to compare and see if we notice any brake fade after consecutive uses before and after.
So I went out and got a benchmark for both, stopping first at the store to get some necessary tools, and then I went to our first location.
This road is long, empty on the weekends, and perfect for our little test.
You can think of this pole as a marker, and this white tape both symbolizes that this is our baseline and helps me see it from further away. You see, my goal is to slam on the brakes as soon as I pass this, and ideally I'll be going a consistent speed both times. And once I come to a complete stop, we're going to hop out of the car and mark where we stopped with a second piece of tape. Now, as far as the speed goes, there's a couple things that I want to do to ensure this is consistent. First things first, don't expect me to be going 100 miles an hour and slamming on the brakes. This car is too slow for that. Plus,
to be honest, it doesn't even matter how fast we're going, more so that we're going the same speed both times we test it, before and after the install.
So I think an accurate speed to test for this car is going to be a crisp 40 miles an hour. While it's not super fast, it's a speed this car can comfortably get up to before the stopping point, so it's going to be perfect for our case. And all we need to do is get a couple runs in. With the second piece of tape in place, I persuaded the car up to speed and slammed on the brakes the second we passed the sign. And to my surprise, the car didn't actually do that poorly. It's not good by any means, nor is there any pedal feel, but it did come to a stop relatively quickly, sooner than I thought even. To make this a little more accurate, I also did 5 runs and took the average. For this test, I'm not exactly going for an exact distance or anything like that. I don't really care about the specific number. All I really want is to see a big difference before and after. So all the numbers I'm using are going to be pretty arbitrary, and that's intentional. And rather than spending 5 minutes laying on the ground with a ruler in a public road, I'm going to use my shoes and wear a consistent pair. I don't really care what the measurement itself is. All I really care about is that I measure it the same way both times, so I can tell an accurate difference. And once I had the average, I took the car over to a nearby back road to try and get the brakes to heat up a bit. And believe it or not, this happened a lot sooner than I thought. Not only is there hardly any pedal feel, but I could really only brake comfortably a couple times before they started to feel like they were losing their effectiveness. The hotter they got, the worse they worked. And since the whole goal of this car is to have as much fun as possible on a back road, I think this kit is really going to help this. But what was even in that kit? When you think of a racing brake setup, what comes to mind? Huge calipers not even designed for the car? Drilled and slotted rotors? Well, this kit goes a different route. The guys over at Advanced Auto Fabrication, that's the race shop, have done a lot of testing for these cars' brakes. Like I said, they build race cars. And in that testing, what they've found is the most cost-effective and useful upgrade for these cars is simply a set of aggressive pads and adequate brake cooling. Since the E30 is such a light car, the stock calipers are more than capable. Where it does need help, however, is in the cooling department. The stock bumper has these inlets that shoot air into the wheel well, and currently all they really do is point towards the tire. But what if they didn't? Now, you might have wondered why the box was so large when I only brought out pads, and as you probably guessed, there was just a little bit more in there, namely some lightweight aluminum pipes, a 3D printed adapter, and some flex hose. These are going to let us direct the air, but if we want to keep the brakes as cool as possible, where is the best place to put that air? Ironically, most brakes come with a dust shield, and this cooling kit comes with a replacement. This replacement's a little different, however. This connects to the rest of those hoses, meaning once this is all set up, we will have a system that will actively cool the brakes faster the faster we drive. Brake fade? Never heard of her. And this air is probably even colder than the intake.
Normally, if you're going to do this, I would highly suggest you check your rotors, and if they're crusty or old, replace them at the same time. My brakes themselves are brand new, or at least relatively new before I bought the car. So I'm not going to be replacing my rotors. We're simply going to swap pads and see if there's a difference because I know the rotors are OEM. Should be fun.
We started with the rear, but before that, I want to talk a little bit more about the rotors specifically. Drilled and slotted rotors sure look cool, but the guys over at AAF recommended stock ones. Not only does that keep costs down, but it actually helps with reliability since they last a little bit longer. And if the goal is to maximize fun while minimizing maintenance, that's the way to go. I guess you could say it would be a stopping sleeper too, so that's why we're just going to replace the pads today. And they're shockingly easy. On the rear, there's basically 3 things you need to remove. The rattle clip on the front, these dust caps on the back, and then the little pins underneath the dust caps which come out with an Allen key. Plus, if your car is anything like mine, the previous owner was kind enough to leave everything hand tight. As sketchy as it is, at least I don't have to struggle getting these off. It's also worth noting that some E30s came with drum brakes. Now, I didn't ask AAF about the drum brakes specifically, but given drum brakes' general reputation, I'm assuming upgrading to the disc equivalents is worth it. With the pins out, you can take the caliper off, and this is going to give you access to both of the pads. Like I mentioned, these pads have a ton of life in them. I'm not replacing them because they're gone, I'm replacing them because I want the car to stop better. And from what I can tell, these are some sort of a pad from Hawk. At first glance, this isn't a bad brand, nor is it a bad pad, but later I ended up finding out that the front aren't even the same kind. They are a completely different pad, so likely the rear was just replaced by itself. That being said, I cleaned all the metal-to-metal contact points and applied a little bit of brake grease. And since the pads were new, I didn't even have to compress the piston. Everything just fit like a glove. And the reassembly was identical to removing it, but in reverse. I figured I would start in the rear because the front is a completely different caliper style and we're going to be adding that cooling system, so there's a lot more work. We also don't really need to worry about cooling the rear brakes because the front brakes do so much more of the work. So the next thing I did was finish up the rest of the rear, following the exact same steps. The rear went exactly as I expected. There wasn't really a ton new since it was just a pad swap. The front, however, was a great chance to learn. Taking the wheel off, you're immediately going to notice that the calipers are different than the rear, and if you've never done brakes before, that is really typical for cars. The front handles the majority of braking, so it's usually a lot better. Most calipers, however, follow a pretty similar layout. There's usually 2 pins of some kind, one on the top and one on the bottom, and in this case you need 2 wrenches to take them off. But once you do, you have access to the pads, and this is when I noticed that these are a completely different brand than what was on the rear. We also don't just get to toss on the new pads right away. We get to take this thing apart even more. To get to the dust shield, we need to take off the caliper hanger with the 2 bolts on the back, followed by the rotor itself, which is held on with 1 bolt. From here, there are 3 bolts holding the dust shield in place, and once you remove them, we actually need to cut the dust shield off. And the reason for that is it sits behind the wheel bearing. So unless you feel like adding that to your list of to-dos for the day, the dust shield is very soft metal, so tin snips work just fine. And if you're worried about exposing everything underneath it, remember, we're adding another dust shield, so that doesn't matter. That being said, once the dust shield is off, you can see where everything is. It's really cool how simple this front spindle is compared to an all-wheel drive car. That's pretty normal, but new to me. Once it's cleaned up a bit, we can add the dust shield, and it sits on this side. The air flowing in from the front of the car is going to directly hit the rotor, so as the car picks up speed, more air will be forced onto the rotor itself, cooling it as we drive. The holes line up perfectly, and it's pretty much a direct swap. The kit also comes with some spacers you can use as well. With that in place, however, we're good to reassemble the brake, starting with the rotor, followed by the caliper hanger, and then finally the caliper and pads. And unlike the rear, I did have to use my piston compressor tool on the front. One of the main reasons you shouldn't run different types of pads, front and rear, is that they wear at different speeds. So since the rear were nicer than the front, we gotta break out Old Faithful. If you do brakes a lot, I highly suggest one of these. You can find them pretty cheap and they work really well. All this does is help you compress the piston. A very specific tool for a very specific job. With that though, we can put the brakes back in place and tighten everything up again. These pads have a little spring on the back, so you kinda have to push the caliper into its home. But once that's done, it's super easy, meaning we can move on to the rest of the cooling kit. For now, I took off most of the wheel liner. We're gonna put it back on later when I have more time, don't worry. But to mock this up, I need the room. The metal pipe is going to sit right here. It screws directly into the car, but the benefits outweigh the con of doing that. When you're trying to figure out where to sit this, you gotta kinda remember that the wheel is going to be rotating. So you want it to sit as far back as possible so you have the most clearance. And once this is in place, it's really as simple as measuring out the flex hose and getting it to connect to the front bumper adapter and to the rotor itself. And the front bumper adapter is the easy one because it's not going to move. The rotor, however, does. And the only reason we need to use flex hose is because it turns. This hose needs to be able to move and change length. So when measuring it, you need to turn your wheel out to figure out the maximum length. That way you're not just going to pull it off when you turn. As an engineer, I think this system is very cool. Plus, it is incredibly satisfying to turn the wheel and watch the flex hose change shape with the position of the spindle. In other words, really impressed so far. From here, we can move on to the other side, which, as you might have guessed, is the same exact process. But since we just did it, it goes a lot faster. As far as placing the metal tube itself, I'll give you a better view this time. The first time I was mostly learning about it myself. You're going to need to remove this under tray right here in order to get it to sit far enough back. Don't worry, ironically they also make an under tray that works with this kit, so that might be coming later. This hose has a curve in it, and the whole goal is effectively to position that curve as far towards the back of the car as possible without it coming into contact with anything else. And the cool thing is, it doesn't even have to be super perfect because we're working with flex hose. It is, however, the first piece you'll need to put in order to actually get the flex hose measured properly. And if you happen to move it after cutting the flex hose, you're going to need to get some more, because it won't be the right size anymore. I'm also quite sure we'll be able to run the wheel liner. Today I had a last minute addition to my calendar that I had to make, so my plan is to mock that up later when I have a bit more time. This side went exactly like the other side did, thankfully. Sometimes jobs have unexpected surprises when you think you've gotten away easy, but this wasn't one of them. It all went really smoothly, but we weren't quite done. Whenever you do a brake job, something a lot of people forget is that you need to bed in the brakes. Even if you're just doing something as simple as a pad swap, you need to look up the pads that you bought. Most of them will have a slightly different process you need to follow in order to get them to work optimally. You basically just gotta remove the factory coating, and that's exactly what I went to do with these. The process for these involved several stops. You increased the speed you stopped from and how fast you tried to stop. You're gonna notice that the brakes stop harder and harder each time. Then you let the brakes cool and do a couple hard stops afterward, and these were ridiculous. So the second we hit the brakes, we're activating ABS and the wheels lock up, so to be brutally honest, we might actually just slide further than our first test. Kind of cool that our brakes are that strong, but at the same time, like, this is kind of ridiculous. That's so good. My initial plan was to head back to the same spot and recreate the comparison test right after this, but I was offered tickets to a concert, and anytime that happens, you always say yes. I feel like that's just a general rule you should follow in life. And if you've never been to a concert, you should definitely go. Live music is always fun, no matter who you see. The next day, however, I made my way back to the testing road. I removed the white tape on the pole, which symbolized our first attempt, and applied some blue tape instead. This is the color I chose to symbolize the final test. And at this point, I was actually pretty nervous. The brakes sure felt a lot better. But if the wheels locked up and there was no grip, we might actually do worse. So I really had no idea how this was gonna go. Only one way to find out. One, two, three. The car stopped violently, and just like the first test, I did this a number of times to get a rough idea of where it would stop on average. Remember, I don't care about the number specifically, I'm more so just looking for a comparison. That being said, you might have noticed that it looks like it stopped a lot faster, and you would be spot on. Somehow the tape from yesterday was still here, and every time I tested this, there was a notable difference. This setup stops the car a ton faster. I used my same consistently inconsistent way of measuring, and the difference averaged about 12 footsteps back to back, almost the entire length of the car every time. Plus, for race brakes, these weren't even that loud. I was thrilled. So following the last test, I took the car on that same back road, where things got even better. Not only did these brakes stop the car to the point where it inspired confidence going into a corner, I really couldn't get them to fade. And believe me, I was trying. For an upgrade that you could consider a safety upgrade, these might be one of the most unsafe upgrades I've done, because I keep trying to wait later and later and later to brake for a corner, and the car keeps accepting that. It just stops. To be honest, the rate this car loses speed is faster than the S4 and the TT. It is actually hilarious to be in. and I mean that in the best way possible. This thing is very quickly becoming an absolute joy to drive, and this upgrade is a huge step in the right direction. I can highly recommend it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. Either way, I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you again, have a wonderful day.